Alright, so the next step, once you've finished your sketch and made all the little changes that you noticed that you want to make, is to go in with ink. And I like to use the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens because I've found that they do not bleed as much with the markers as some other pens I've used. But really it's a matter of personal preference. What you want to make sure you do is let it dry before you put on your marker, so you'll give it a few minutes after you ink it. And this is where you have to start being really careful because you cannot erase this the way you can erase the pencil. I recommend going for the top parts of the drawing first, by which I don't mean the top of the page, I mean the foreground. So the glasses are in front of most other things on the face here, so I'm starting with the glasses. And the one exception I'll make is there's one spot where the nose goes in front of the glasses, and so when I get there, I'll do the nose before the glasses. And you still look at your reference here, because anywhere that the pencil lines are unclear, you do still want to use that to determine what you're doing. You can use small areas of filled in black pen for some of your very darkest spots, like I'm doing that on the inner rim of the glasses here. And that'll ultimately be right next to a highlight, because inside the inner rim of the glasses is the inner rim of the lens, because I've got very thick lenses on my glasses. Without them, I cannot see anything. And that contrast will bring more attention to the area near the eyes, in addition to just being the accurate depiction of what the glasses look like. So it's a win-win. The nice thing about working on toned paper is that you don't have to be quite as careful to conserve your highlights, because you can put over them, and you should, a white pen to make them really pop out from the paper. What you want to be careful to conserve on toned paper is actually your mid-tones, because that's what you won't be able to lift up or hide. And I get every little detail in the glasses. They are an important part of the face. Most of the time, people who wear glasses wear them all the time, unless they're like reading glasses, and if they're reading glasses, well, you probably won't see them in a portrait. So for likeness, glasses are just as important as anything else on the face, in my opinion. One nice thing about these pens is that they come in all different weights. This one is one of the thicker ones. It's the 1.5 bullet pen. It's my personal favorite for inking, but there are much smaller ones you can use if you want thinner lines. When I'm doing marker work, I like to line all my shadow shapes. I think it gives it a very cool graphic effect. But if you want something more realistic and grounded, You can either skip the black lines altogether and just go straight to marker from your sketch, in which case you'll want to lighten up the sketch some before putting on your marker. Or you can line only the major elements of the drawing and do all your shadow shapes with the marker later on. So the last bit of the glasses here is the arm, and that actually does go behind quite a few elements in this drawing, so I'm going to wait to add it in until after I have done more of the face. Everybody's eyebrows are different and they're very important for likeness. Mine are unusual in that I will sometimes pull them out when I'm anxious, and so you can see in this particular reference one of them is a bit thicker than the other, and you want to capture that in your drawing because that really makes it look like the person you're drawing if you get all their features. And although once something in the ink is on the paper, it is final, you don't want to get too bogged down in worrying about that, because if you do make a mistake, you can usually just work it into the drawing, and if it doesn't look intentional, it will generally at least look inconspicuous. I like to go a little thicker with my line work on the lash line, because that helps give the appearance of the eyelashes. And when the eyelashes are very visible, like they are in this reference, you do want to define them a bit more. But unless you can see them like that, you don't really have to define them individually. And even if you can see them, it's your drawing and you can choose not to detail them like that. Here's an example of making changes in your inking stage. I noticed on my reference the pupils are wider and thicker than I had drawn them in the sketch, and so I'm increasing their width some in the final drawing. The white of the eye has shading of its own. It's not just pure white, and you want to get those shadow shapes too. And in fact, when you are finishing the drawing, none of that area should be pure white unless there's a highlight. You want to put a very light color over it instead of pure white. When you do decide to detail eyelashes, which again, you don't have to do for every piece, you want to carefully look at your reference and make sure that you're drawing them accurately and not just drawing lines where you think the eyelashes should go, because they do tend to look very different than you would expect, or like how you see them drawn in cartoons. Similarly, when you're doing the eyes, you want to be careful you're getting all your shadows, and you want to be careful that you're getting, I don't know what it's called, but tear duct. You want to be sure you get that. That's the little area on the edge of your eye. It's most visible on the inner corner. You can sort of see it in this particular reference on the outer corner as well because of the angle. The appearance of people's eyes varies a lot based on the lighting, even for just the same person. So you want to take into account what the lighting is of the piece that you're working on. In this case, because there's a very harsh head-on light, lighter browns are visible in the eye, but without that bright light shining right on the face, it would be much more of a solid dark brown color. The shape of the eyelids is another very important thing for likeness. Everybody's are different, and So you want to get, if they're pronounced, if you can barely see them, where their uppermost point is, where the fold is darkest, all of that you want to capture in your drawing. When I set for this particular modeling session, I was wearing glitter underneath my eyes, and the black won't be the final marker of that, but I'm going ahead and laying that down because I'm going to cover it up with the bright white pen, and I need to remember where it is. Generally, the more detail you can get in a piece like this, the more complete it's going to look. You don't need to invent details that aren't there, but anything you see, it's good to include. From this angle, you can see how the philtrum sort of comes from within the nose. And on the nostril, there's a little area where that skin comes inside. And you can capture that in your drawing, and it will add more depth to the face. Most of the time there will be a big highlight on the ball of the nose. This particular drawing is no exception, and that's a very important highlight that you always want to get in your drawing. The nose, of course, is also very important for likeness. There are all types of noses, and everybody's nose is distinct. So although it's generally one of the more difficult parts of the drawing to get right, it's also one of the more important, which is why I spent so long on it in the sketch, because that's not a feature that you just abandon ship on if you're having trouble. One of the most important things when drawing, really no matter what medium you're using, is even if you're really invested in how it's going to come out, you want to be sure that you're not getting in your head too much. If you mess it up, you mess it up. And you can either start over or make the best of it. I usually just make the best of it because oftentimes a mistake will add character instead of ruining the drawing. If you can see, I am varying my line weight a little bit here. I'm going a little less heavy on shadow shapes and a little heavier on concrete features. The lips have a lot of detail to them. People's lips tend to be a little bit wrinkly, and that means that they end up with a lot of very complex shadows and highlights. Trying to capture every single bit of that would probably make the lips the focal point of your drawing, which would look strange. So you do want to simplify a little bit here, but not too much. You want to still keep that complexity even though you're toning it down a bit. underneath the lip, there's a slight light area and then a shadow. And this is another one of the more prominent shadows on the face, even though it's not always necessarily one of the darkest. And so you do want to be very sure about that placement. For some of the lighter, less distinct shadow shapes, something you can do to give them that lighter quality is using broken lines instead of a concrete outline. I've done that in a lot of places on this drawing, but I really want to draw attention to it here, since if you look at the reference, this is a shadow shape that's barely visible, but it's there, and so you want to include it. The nose casts a shadow off to the side here. It's not super dramatic, but it's an important shadow nonetheless. Another part of the face that often gets a bit neglected is the forehead. It's not nearly as complex as other parts of the face, but it still has its own distinct light and shadow areas. A lot of that is determined by the location of other things near it, like the hair and the eyebrows. And you want to be sure that you capture that. I'll add most of the rendering of that after I do the hair, since it's such an important determinant. But I'm going ahead and doing a few of the little shadows near the eyebrows. Now, I'm adding a little bit of the hair here. I'll probably not do all of it right this second. But when you're doing the hair, you want to try to have a little bit more of a loose, quick line to give it that feeling of being flowing, at least with this type of hair. If you've got someone with a more controlled, tight style, you may go a little tighter. Hair varies so much, there's no real one way to draw it. So this will really depend on your model and their hairstyle. But the one constant is that, just like with the rest of the face, you really want to pay attention to where the lights and shadows are. The hair will cast shadows on the ear, and so will the rest of the face. You want to pay attention to where that's happening so that you can capture it. The level of shading you want to do in your inking stage is really up to you. I tend to only do it in the very darkest spots, but in some of my older work, I would do hatching in nearly all of the shadows, and that is a very good technique to use if you have a limited number of markers, which is pretty common because they are expensive. So if you've got, let's say, only one marker in the right skin tone for your drawing, well, you can sort of solve that problem by doing a lot of your shading through hatching and cross-hatching in your inking stage, and then just using that one marker as sort of your base tone everywhere except in the highlights and in areas where you bring in another color to show a reflected shade. Like in this one, there's going to be some greens on the neck and face where that's being bounced up from some of the more greenish sequins. The hair is probably the place where direct accuracy is the least important, because you want it to look somewhat looser and more flowing than most other elements on the face. Again, at least with this particular hairstyle. some parts of the hair will tend to overlap other parts, and you want to check and see which parts those are so that you can accurately render their relationship. Some of the darkest area here blacked in like dark ink. If you have an area of really dark hair right near the face, that's a good opportunity to ramp up the contrast. Now that I've got the hair added in, I can really focus on the shadows it casts on the face. This is especially prominent on the forehead since there's not much else casting shadows on the forehead. But even down further on the face, you can see the shadows from the hair. I forgot to include this in my sketch, so I'm just going to freehand it in now. The chin is another place where shadows are sometimes more pronounced, as are highlights. Once again, in this case, they're a little more subtle, but they are still there. In more dramatic cases, it's easier to spot them, but with experience, you'll be able to pick them out even when it's much more subtle, although you do sometimes have to look pretty closely. Underneath the ear, and sort of behind the jaw, there's a very pronounced shadow that both the ear and the jaw cast on that particular spot on the neck. Underneath the chin is an area that tends to have a lot of different variations within the shadows, and also some areas where light from elsewhere in the piece bounces back and reflects. And that's somewhere where you don't want to neglect adding those details. The neck also tends to have some folds on it. That's much more noticeable on older models most of the time, but even on very young models, it's still there, and you can get those little shadows in very subtly. Now I'm moving on to the clothing. This is a turtleneck shirt, but the edge of the neckline actually comes down below a fold that goes higher up. Since it's a black shirt, it's a little bit hard to see that detail, but if you look closely you can spot it. Fabric is another place where, at least when it's more flowy and draped like this turtleneck, you go a little bit looser, kind of like you do in the hair. I'm going to define the lapel of the jacket, which is a much thicker, stronger fabric than the turtleneck, and so it gets more definition. It's got a little ribbing on it, which you can do either with the marker or with the pen. I'm going to do it with the pen today, since it's a very dark lapel. And here I'm going to start doing the sequined dress. Once again, you don't have to define every sequin, especially not before you even get to color, but you want to sort of get that lumpy outline that they give the garment. I included this detail on the other part of the dress too, but it's much more visible here. There's an area where you can see the black lining of the sequin dress underneath the sequins, and it's a much straighter edge than the sequins. This will be a darker part of the jacket, so the ribbing won't quite be as visible, but you'll still be able to faintly see it even after it's colored. So I'm still including the detail. Alright, so now that my lining is done for the most part, I'm going to step back and look at the drawing to see if there's any last details that I want to add.